The message came late in the evening, just as I was finishing a cup of tea and staring at the quiet street outside my window. I didn't expect it, not from him, not after so long. We haven't seen you in years. If you're free tomorrow evening, come spend the night at our place, Daniel had written. A minute later, another message appeared from Mark, almost as if they were sitting side by side while typing. It would be good to catch up. We'd like to see you. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure why my hands felt warm and my heartbeat sounded louder than usual. These were my father's closest friends, men who had known me since I was a teenager, who visited our house often, who spoke kindly when my father didn't, who noticed quiet things that adults often ignore in growing children. Now, years later, the girl they once knew had faded, replaced by the woman I had forced myself to become. Maybe that was why their invitation felt different. It wasn't childish nostalgia pulling me in, it was something I couldn't name. I replied before I could talk myself out of it. I'll come. The next day moved strangely slow. I kept checking the clock, wondering why I felt like I was preparing for something important, something delicate. By evening, when I finally reached their house, my breath stuck for a moment as the door opened and both men appeared with the same warm, familiar expressions I remembered. But there was something new too, something quieter, heavier, like a recognition of time past. You grew up, Daniel said softly, not as a comment on my appearance, but like he was acknowledging years of unseen battles. Mark smiled in his gentle way, stepping aside to let me in. Their home looked different from what I remembered, warmer, more lived in, filled with books, soft lamps, and the faint smell of cedar and something cooking in the kitchen. Dinner felt unexpectedly easy. We talked about everything except my father, and I noticed how intentional that silence was. They knew. They always knew. They asked about my work, my life, the things that kept me awake at night, and I found myself speaking more openly than I had intended. Maybe it was the atmosphere, the way they listened with genuine focus, or the way the room felt separate from the rest of the world, as if time had loosened its grip inside their walls. There were moments when I caught Daniel watching me with an expression I couldn't interpret, half concern, half something softer. And every time Mark laughed at something I said, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds I had grown used to. Their company was comforting in a way I didn't realize I had been craving. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The lights were dimmed, a single lamp glowing beside the couch. I sat between them like it was the most natural place in the world, though my heart fluttered with a confusing rhythm. The conversation shifted toward memories, how they used to visit our house, how my father would talk proudly about small achievements I didn't think he even remembered. But when I mentioned how distant I felt from him now, a shadow passed across both their faces. You deserved more than what you got, Daniel said quietly. Mark nodded, leaning back, watching me with thoughtful eyes. You handled everything alone, didn't you? Their awareness of my loneliness made me swallow harder than I meant to. I didn't want pity, but what they offered wasn't pity, it was understanding, the kind that comes from people who had been watching from a distance for years, wishing they could intervene. The night deepened. The house fell quiet except for the sound of the wind brushing lightly against the windows. I could feel a shift in the air, subtle, careful, unspoken. None of us moved for a long time. Something about the silence made my skin tingle, not out of fear, but anticipation of something I couldn't yet define. When I finally looked up, Daniel's eyes met mine with a depth I had never seen in him before. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't bold. It was simply honest, like he had been holding a truth for too long. Mark noticed the exchange, and his expression softened in a way that made my breath catch. There was no judgment between them, no tension, only a quiet awareness that the atmosphere had shifted, and none of us knew where it would lead. For a moment, I wondered if I should break the silence, say something casual to steady the air around us. But I didn't, and neither did they. It felt like the night itself was waiting. And so were we. The night stretched on in a way that made minutes feel slower, heavier. I could feel it the moment Daniel shifted slightly toward me, not enough to touch, but enough that the warmth of his presence brushed my skin in a way that made my breath pause. Mark noticed, of course he did, he always noticed things before anyone else, and instead of moving away or interrupting, he simply watched me with a calmness that unsettled me far more than anything else. I didn't understand what was happening, only that something inside me was responding. The part of me that had spent years suppressing emotion, avoiding attention, shrinking in my father's presence, was suddenly awake, alert, drawn to the gentle gravity pulling me toward these two men who had always treated me with more kindness than he ever had. I shifted my gaze to the low flame in the fireplace, trying to steady myself. "It's strange being here again," I said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I missed this. The peace." Daniel leaned his elbow on the back of the couch, his voice low. "You were always tense in your father's house. Even as a kid, you carried too much." The words landed deeper than I expected. It startled me how accurately he saw me, how accurately he had always seen me. I looked at him then, truly looked. His eyes weren't the eyes of a father's friend. They were the eyes of a man who knew me, who noticed the smallest cracks in my expression, who had been watching from outside my world for years. Mark spoke next, his voice softer, almost cautious. "We've always worried about you. You never had anyone to lean on." The admission caught me off guard. "You worried about me." "Of course we did," he replied with a gentle firmness. "We just didn't want to interfere." A silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something I didn't know how to name. A quiet understanding, a shared history, and maybe a sense that the lines we once followed so carefully were beginning to blur. I leaned back slowly, sinking into the cushions. Daniel's hand rested close enough that if I shifted my fingers just slightly, they would touch. I didn't move. I didn't dare. But my pulse quickened all the same. Mark rose from his seat and walked to the small bar near the wall, pouring water into 3 glasses. When he came back, he offered one to me first, his fingers brushing mine briefly, just a second, just enough to feel the warmth of his skin. And yet that moment felt like it lingered far longer than it should have. We talked again, but the conversation had changed. It wasn't about the past anymore. It wasn't about memories or old stories. It was about me, about them, about the present moment none of us had expected. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked suddenly. The question hit me harder than it should have. Happiness, such a simple word, yet so foreign to me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't even know what that's supposed to feel like." Daniel's expression softened with a protectiveness that made my chest tighten. "You should. You deserve to." Mark settled back into his seat on my other side, closer this time, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to pretend with us." Something in his tone made my throat go dry. I turned slightly toward him, and for a moment, the room felt unbearably still. His eyes held mine with an intensity that wasn't loud or demanding, just honest. A kind of honesty I wasn't used to receiving. I could feel them both on either side of me, not touching, not crossing any boundaries, but the closeness was enough to make everything inside me feel unsteady. My father's 2 closest friends, the men who had seen me grow up, who had stepped into emotional spaces he never cared to fill, were now the men making me feel seen in a way I had never experienced. "I'm not used to attention like this," I whispered, unsure why my voice felt so fragile. Daniel's hand, finally, slowly, brushed the back of mine. A light touch, a question more than a gesture. I didn't pull away. Mark noticed, and instead of tension, his expression softened even more, like he understood exactly what I needed even before I did. "You deserve to be cared for," Mark said quietly. "Really cared for. Not halfway, not conditionally." I looked between them, Daniel's steady gaze, Mark's gentle warmth, and something inside me broke open. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, nor was it anything forbidden or reckless. It was simply connection. The kind I had been starved of for years. The house was silent around us. The wind outside had become softer, the quiet deeper. The lamps cast a warm glow that made the moment feel suspended in time. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I only breathed, for perhaps the first time in years, without feeling like I needed to hide any part of myself. And in that quiet, unguarded space between the 3 of us, something shifted again, slowly, naturally, undeniably. The night wasn't over, and none of us were pretending anymore. The night had deepened into something that felt suspended outside of time. I woke to the faint glow of early morning sunlight slipping through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold. Daniel was sitting in the armchair near the window, his gaze fixed on some distant point outside, while Mark was quietly arranging a stack of books on the shelf. The stillness of the house was calming, yet it carried an almost electric tension that made my chest tighten. I hesitated before moving, aware of the space between us. Something unspoken lingered in the air, a delicate balance between familiarity and desire, understanding and uncertainty. I had never experienced anything like it, a room filled with people I trusted completely, and yet somehow, trust had become charged with a new, complicated intensity. Mark noticed my movement first and turned toward me with a gentle smile. "You're awake," he said softly. There was no accusation, no surprise, only an acknowledgement that made me feel seen. I nodded, unable to speak at first, and moved to sit on the edge of the couch. The simple act of sitting there between them, as an adult fully aware of their presence, carried a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. Daniel shifted slightly to face me. "You looked restless in your sleep," he said quietly, not in judgment but concern. His voice had that calm authority I had always found comforting, and yet now it carried a tension that I couldn't quite name. I realized suddenly that the same two men who had once treated me like a child were now treating me as something else entirely, someone grown, someone complex, someone who could evoke feelings they themselves barely understood. I took a deep breath. I didn't expect last night to feel like this, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. I thought it would be simple, just visiting, catching up. But it feels different. Mark stepped closer, close enough that I could feel his presence without him touching me. "It's always different with you," he said softly. "We've watched you grow, cared about you quietly. But now, you're here, and everything feels more real." I swallowed hard. "It's confusing," I whispered. "I feel connected to both of you in ways I never imagined. And I feel guilty too, because of my father." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not doing anything wrong by feeling," he said. "Feelings aren't crimes. You've been deprived of this care for too long, and it's normal to crave it now." Mark nodded, his expression tender. "We're not asking you to make a decision. We're not forcing anything. We just want you to know that your emotions are valid. That you are allowed to want connection, comfort, affection." The words wrapped around me like a warm blanket. For years, I had been so careful not to need anything from anyone, so careful not to depend on anyone's attention or approval. And now, sitting there between two men who had quietly loved me in their own way all this time, I realized how deeply I had starved for acknowledgement. I looked from Daniel to Mark, and suddenly the house felt both intimate and vast at the same time. I could feel their unspoken care in the way they watched me, in the way their bodies leaned subtly toward mine, in the quiet patience they offered without pressure. It was a tension I hadn't known I could feel, a longing tempered by understanding, a desire tempered by respect. I don't know what to do with these feelings," I admitted, my voice barely audible. It's overwhelming." Daniel reached out, his hand brushing the back of mine in the simplest, most tentative way possible. My pulse jumped. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly. "Just let yourself feel. That's enough for now." Mark's eyes softened even further, and he mirrored Daniel's gesture, his fingers lightly touching mine. It was not intrusive, not inappropriate, just present. And yet, that small contact carried an intensity that made my heart race. For the first time in years, I felt safe in the exact way I had always wanted. Not just protected, not just understood, but truly seen and acknowledged. I realized, as the sun climbed higher and filled the room with light, that this night had changed everything. The emotional boundaries I had held onto for so long had shifted, and though the future remained uncertain, I knew I would never be the same. And in that quiet morning, with Daniel on one side and Mark on the other, I finally let myself admit the truth. I had feelings for both of them, feelings that were complicated, confusing, and undeniably real. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of them. The world outside might never understand, but in that moment, in that room, I belonged to this shared connection, and it was enough. The morning air was crisp, carrying the quiet hum of a world that seemed oblivious to the weight of the night we had shared. I dressed slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that lingered in the house. Daniel was in the kitchen, making coffee with his usual quiet efficiency, while Mark sat near the window, reading yet again, though I could see his attention had wandered toward me more than once. I paused for a moment in the doorway, observing them. There was no tension, no awkwardness, only a subtle acknowledgement that everything had shifted. I had crossed an invisible line, yet it wasn't the kind of line that demanded immediate consequences. It was a line of understanding, of emotions laid bare, of connection that was undeniable and, in its own complicated way, beautiful. "I should go soon," I said quietly, almost to myself. My voice sounded strange in the stillness, almost foreign. Both men looked up immediately, their expressions open, patient, and gentle. You don't have to rush, Daniel said softly. Stay as long as you need. Mark offered a small smile. Even if you leave, nothing changes the fact that we care. That's not bound by time or space. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and melancholy. The night had been everything I didn't know I needed. I had allowed myself to be vulnerable in ways I never thought I could. I had let two men into my emotional world, trusted them, and in turn, allowed them to care for me without judgment. The weight of that trust and care was almost overwhelming, yet it felt like the first breath of fresh air after years underwater. We sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee in companionable silence. The room was filled with warmth from the morning sun and the gentle hum of small movements, a spoon clinking against a mug, the soft rustle of pages, the quiet sigh of a chair sliding across the floor. Nothing extraordinary happened, yet every small moment felt charged with significance. I never thought it would be like this, I admitted finally, my voice trembling slightly. I didn't know I could feel so safe, and yet, so conflicted. Daniel reached out, touching my hand briefly. Conflicted is natural. You've carried so much alone for so long. Feeling deeply now isn't something to be ashamed of. Mark leaned slightly closer, his eyes soft and unwavering. Life isn't always neat. People aren't always neat. Emotions aren't neat. What matters is honesty, and you've been honest with yourself and with us. That's courage. I smiled faintly, feeling a tear prick the corner of my eye. The acknowledgement, the understanding, the absence of judgment, it was everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing. My father had never given me that. And now, in this quiet house, I had received it from two people who had always seen me, always cared for me, and always respected my boundaries. The decision to leave felt heavy, yet it was necessary. I stood, smoothing my clothes, my gaze moving between Daniel and Mark. I have to go. But I'll never forget this night. Not the laughter, not the silence, not any of it. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable yet tender. Neither will we, and that's okay. Memories are powerful, and this one is yours to keep, as well as ours to cherish. Mark reached out, brushing a hand lightly against my shoulder. You've changed something in all of us. Something good. Don't ever doubt that. I swallowed, feeling the lump in my throat, and walked toward the door. The hallway stretched before me, light spilling in from the windows, illuminating the quiet floorboards. I paused at the threshold, turning for one last look. Daniel and Mark were still there, watching me with a mixture of care and something deeper, something unspoken that didn't need to be named. When I stepped outside, the sunlight kissed my face, and the world seemed both larger and smaller at once. Larger because of the possibilities, smaller because of the intimacy I had shared with them. My heart was full, yet heavy. I had crossed a line that night, a line I could never uncross, and yet, it had been worth it. Worth every pang of guilt, every fleeting moment of doubt, every heartbeat that had raced in their quiet presence. As I walked down the path, the house fading behind me, I realized something important. Love, care, and attention don't always arrive where we expect them. Sometimes, they come from places we never imagined, and sometimes, they leave us changed forever. I had received a gift that night, fragile, complicated, and beautiful, and I knew I would carry it with me always. I didn't look back again. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I understood that some connections, once made, live within you forever, quiet, powerful, and unshakable. And that night, I had learned to let myself be seen in ways I never had before. It was the first time I truly felt alive.